legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Carole Nervig, who joins us to discuss her book, The Petroglyphs of Mu, Pohnpei, Madol, and the Legacy of Lemuria. Myths and legends from around the world tell of a lost, ancient civilization swept away by a major catastrophe during prehistoric times. The people or peoples dimly remembered are often said to have been technologically advanced, culturally sophisticated, and capable of amazing feats that the scientists and engineers of our age still cannot comprehend. The fate of both Lemuria and Atlantis represent perhaps the best known telling of such tales. Biblical stories such as those of the fall of man and Noah and the Ark, the latter also reflected in the many other flood myths, echo suppressed species memories of some ancient cataclysm which may have brought humanity to the brink of extinction. Other cosmologies paint a very different picture from mainstream accounts of human antiquity and evolution, including our origins amongst the stars, or perhaps even other dimensions of space-time. As we collectively face an increasingly uncertain future, what might the past have to teach us about the people that we were, that we are, and that we could be?
Hello and welcome, Carole. Thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Well, thank you, Greg. I am delighted to be here. Love sharing about my book. So looking forward to it.
Yes, well, we're going to be talking about that very book today and related subjects. The book is entitled The Petroglyphs of Mu, Pohnpei, Madol, and the Legacy of Lemuria. Before we jump into that, if you could give listeners just a little bit of information about your background and your work in general.
Well, my relationship with Pohnpei, Madol, and began in 1969. I was assigned to Pohnpei Island in the Peace Corps, and I was teaching English as a second language in a tiny 2-room schoolhouse about 3 miles from Madol. So that's when I was first exposed to that site, and at that time, I was shocked that, the world didn't really know much about didn't even know it existed. So I took it upon myself during the summer when school was out to interview the Pohnpeian elders about the oral histories of the site, and produced a little a booklet at that time, the first non-academic. I mean, there were some papers, but nothing for general consumption. So that's how it started. And then after my Peace Corps service, I came back again in 1990 to help create a nonprofit for the preservation and protection of Madol. And that was quite a move. And it was at that time when I came across this burned off field that was covered with megaliths, which were covered with petroglyphs. And it was adjacent to a known petroglyph site. And this really got me, this triggered years of research and eventually to this book, trying to document and explain what this site was for and the petroglyphs and meaning in the context of a world of other sites, similar sites.
So tell us about places on the globe here, because it's certainly not a part of the world I'm very familiar with. Never been anywhere near there, but even in terms of not just your specific research, but just general history. it's a region I know very little about. So for those of us who don't know, if you could just, spin the globe for us and just tell us the region that we're talking about.
Certainly. Micronesia is in the far northwestern Pacific, and the island of Pohnpei is within the Federated States of Micronesia, which there are 4 states: Kosrae, Pohnpei, Yap, and Chuuk. And other parts of Micronesia are the Republic of Palau, the Commonwealth of the Marianas Islands, and the Republic of Marshall Islands. And these are all fairly new political delineations after World War II. And the Micronesia culturally is one of 3. Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia are 3 areas of Pacific island cultures and islands. And Polynesia, meaning many islands, Melanesia, meaning islands with inhabitants with dark skin, and Micronesia, meaning tiny islands. Micronesia, I think it's a little bit over 2,000 islands are included in Micronesia, geographical Micronesia, and most of them are tiny atolls. And so the majority of Micronesia is just water, just the ocean. To place it, many are familiar with Guam. Guam is geographically part of Micronesia, not politically. And Pohnpei Island is about 2.5-hour flight southwest of Guam.
Okay, so you mentioned that you'd written a little bit earlier, before your book came together, about this region. What, as someone who's very interested indeed in megalithic culture and prehistoric human history, this was new on my radar, and I wasn't surprised to learn of there being, this sort of evidence really anywhere in the world. Wouldn't surprise me. It does seem to be, a truly global phenomenon. But any work done in this area, yours was the first I've come across. Are you the first person to publish anything substantial on this? Why do you think that? I mean, because I've spoken with many megalithic experts, and this particular region has never come up. Maybe because they were just focused on better known parts of the world. I'm not sure.
Well, the site of Madol, which is the city it's often referred to as the Venice of the Pacific. It has over about 100 artificial islets, and that site has recently got World Heritage status, I believe, in 2016. And so that's on the radar now of some people interested in these ancient megalithic sites. However, there are still a lot of mysteries around it. So, when people don't have answers, they sometimes skip over it, and it's so remote and so expensive. It's difficult to get there and expensive to get there. So, however, the Petroglyphs site, which is approximately 3-4 miles as the crow flies from the well-known Madol, that site has been a portion of that. So this is what's kind of confusing about Pohnpei. There are, I would describe it as 2 parts to that site. One is this enormous basalt natural outcrop, and that's covered with petroglyphs. And people and Pohnpeians in general have known about that for a long, long time. And they have been, most of those petroglyphs have been documented. However, when I came across this burned meadow adjacent to the known site, none of the petroglyphs were documented at that time. And with a very few exceptions, most are still not documented. And the reason being that this site with the megaliths and boulders in the meadow has been covered with, rainforest jungle. Pohnpei receives about 400 and some inches of rain a year. So it was just this fluke that there was a drought, and the kids, just for fun, lit matches and burned the field because they could. And the result of that was seeing all these megaliths that no one even knew were there. I mean, rocks and megalith, that's not that unusual, but the fact they're covered with petroglyphs is.
So did you find out about this? I say it's amazing that this was uncovered more or less by accident, but did you find out about this and then travel to view it, to photograph, to document it? Or were you already there and then you suddenly discovered that this was a thing, that this area had been exposed?
Well, I was already there, and I was, like I said, I was the director of the Madol Foundation at that time. And there were some visiting consultants from the Australia National University there. And I did a presentation for them about Madol. And later we were all having dinner. And one of the consultants, I believe he's a geologist, he started asking me about petroglyphs. And I said, well, yeah, there's some. I mean, referring to the well-known ones on the outcrop. And he asked me lots of questions, and I didn't think they were particularly remarkable, but I was no expert at the time about petroglyphs. Anyway, he kept bugging me, will you please take me? I want to see it. And so, okay, you rent an air-conditioned car and I'll go. So when we arrived to see the known site, the drought and the burning of the meadow had taken place. So we got to the fork in the road and it's like, oh my God. So we went immediately to this new burned off area and came across all these petroglyphs. That was the first time I'd ever seen them. And everyone on the historic preservation officer at the time I took him to the site and showed him. And the families knew there were stones with writing on, but they didn't, they had no explanations for what the site was used for, nor the meanings of the glyphs. So I concluded, well, this is older than the known oral histories and present culture.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. That puts the local population, even in terms of their own history and folklore, at a kind of a loss, in the same way that many of us are in other parts of the world with sites of similar antiquity. And let's not forget that these things are sometimes very conservatively dated. As Graham Hancock keeps pointing out in his blog posts, stuff just keeps getting older. They keep rolling back the dating of these things as time goes on. So what did local history and historians, in terms of whether archaeology or whether folklore or mythology, have to say about any of this? Or was it kind of just, we don't know?
Well, the only oral histories surrounding the petroglyph site, and again, I'm referring to the old part of the site because the meadow people didn't realize it was there, or at least now they don't. So one was an oral history or legend about the creation of the petroglyph site, the outcrop site. And that was two brothers or magicians, shamans, whatever, from the neighboring district stole a blanket, and they took the blanket to this site, whether they walk or flew or, there are varying versions, and they placed the blanket on the ground there, and thus creating, a blanket might have patterns or designs on it. So I'm assuming the legend is their way of explaining petroglyphs. And the interesting part was after they laid the blanket down on this, where this outcrop is, there was a doorway in the rock. And after they laid it down, the two of them exited through this doorway, never to return again. So this hints of portals or interdimensional travel.
Yes, well, that's something that I'll raise again later, and maybe you can speculate more about that. I know I sent you, I mean, this is not a new idea as far as I'm concerned, but this comes up again and again, this idea, we're thinking about the function of these sites or the particular qualities or quirks of these sites, just that which sets them apart from the everyday, the almost supernatural or paranormal accounts of events at such sites. I mean, there are many, and certainly the idea of portals. Again, we can talk about later, because I did send you an article that I'd written based on an interview with Thomas Sheridan about this, and it was an idea that he was playing around with as well. One of the first things here, when we were talking about antediluvian civilization, like sort of pre-flood civilization, and most of my listeners, I think, will be familiar with the idea of the biblical flood, not talking about the veracity or otherwise of people, places, and events in the Bible, but we have flood myths around the world, and clearly sea levels rise and fall, particularly over geologic periods of time. There are megalithic sites currently underwater that we know about, and sea level was certainly a lot lower, for example, during the last ice age, at least, when a lot of the water was tied up in the vast ice fields covering a great deal of the northern hemisphere. But when you mentioned the figure of 2,000 small islands, some of them just tiny atolls, and when we think about other better known sites, for example, such as Easter Island, these archipelagos, these outcrops, and you can even look at parts of Northern Europe, even the British Isles in this context. Again and again around the world, there seems to be these tiny outcrops of land and discoveries there, archaeological finds, prehistoric finds, megalithic sites, the scale of which seems to kind of belie the tiny size of their location. But of course, what this is simply telling us is that we should be looking at much lower sea levels, potentially, probably, highly likely at the time that these sites were being constructed, were in their original use.
Oh, precisely. And of course, these Pacific islands, the mountaintops of the lands that were once there. And specifically regarding that, the Pohnpei legends are, and in the South Pacific cultures, oral history is their highest art form, or one of the highest, I should say. I mean, they memorize generation after generation. They know their ancestors, and they memorize these oral histories, and it's an art form. And so to not take that seriously is a significant error, I think, when you're looking at prehistory in the Pacific. So, and in regard to that, the Pohnpei legends are very clear that Madol was built. These twin brothers, maybe giants, came from the outside. They climbed this pyramidal peak. They tried different sites around the island for their religious, ceremonial, and administrative center, and none of them worked, and they kept going. They climbed this pyramidal-shaped peak on Madolin Bay, looking for a site, and they saw the city of the ancients under the water. Well, so that's why they built Madol where it was, as a memorial to the city of the shining city under the water. So they're very clear that they're about why Madol was built where it was built. And my feeling is that the petroglyph site, Madol, is on sea level, on the water, and this petroglyph site is up higher inland, not on the highest peaks, but it's significantly higher. And so I believe that there's a relationship with the petroglyph site to the underwater city. And again, it might, depending on the migrations before and after the deluge catastrophes, it could have either been contemporary with that city under the water, because often mountaintops are sacred places for shamans and rituals and connection with the divine. So it could have been contemporary, or like Madol, but earlier than Madol, a memorial also to that city, or marking that place, because all three places, they would be attracted there because of that area being a portal. So, in my opinion.
Well, one thing that comes up again and again is this idea that something that was certainly when I learned about ancient history, or the history of the human race and the planet, beyond the point when actually we can really say many concrete things about it, because just things get so hazy. Certainly back to the last ice age. Beyond that, we just can't really. But I would initially have been educated to reject the idea of any global travel, in the ancient past. But it comes up again and again, this idea of an relatively advanced seafaring culture around the world, and there'd be a lot more global travel than perhaps would have been accepted. For example, if you look at relatively modern history with the idea of Columbus discovering America, we know that's not the case. Vikings were in North America prior to that. But you start to rewind, start to go back thousands of years, and there's this suggestive evidence of global seafaring culture. Doesn't mean that it was one culture necessarily, may have been, may not. But when we start to see common symbols and similar styles of building and just traits that repeat again and again, it's suggestive of either the 100th monkey syndrome, where people think of the same things at the same time. Nothing's unique in the world, or maybe the symbolism, for example, symbolism that's derived from astronomical observations. Maybe that could be repeated globally, without global communication. But it's all suggestive in the ancient past that there was, a network, there was communication. And this would be more easily, despite what I said about seafaring, this would be more easily facilitated at a time when the sea level was lower and there was more travel possible across land. Again, at the time when a lot of these sites were constructed, I suppose. So I guess the nub of what I'm saying is that this linear idea that we go back to the Stone Age and our hunter-gatherer ancestors were living in caves and scratching around and had no technology beyond flint or a stone axe or something. This isn't borne out, but with the archaeological evidence.
Well, for sure. And the distances one would have to travel if you're going via water, of course, and especially if there are large land masses that are no longer there, made it much easier. And even today, the Pacific Islanders are known for their navigational skills, especially in Micronesia, and they can cross the Pacific with the stars, and they proved it, and recently. So whether it was in some kind of a traditional ship or canoe, or whether it was some kind of advanced technology, air travel of some sort, there are a lot of possibilities. And I'm always, and it's just not one, like you say, not one linear movement or time frame, or, we've got all these different cultures spanning the globe. And what am I trying to say here? What I find the most interesting, and I know some about indigenous cultures of the Pacific and maybe not so much about the rest of the world, but the little I do know, there are so many basic similarities between the indigenous of the world. And of course, the main commonality is their reverence to the land, the earth, Mother Nature.
So I don't know if you've, talking about Graham Hancock and stuff just keeps getting older. Are you familiar with the work of Michael Cremo?
Well, yes, I am. And he was one of the first. In fact, I saw years ago, I saw his lecture at Port Townsend, Washington. And yes, and he, certainly played a valuable role because he professionally documents these sites and situations. And again, he was one of the first.
Well, one of the main things to derive from his work, for example, Forbidden Archaeology and some of the ideas in his book, Human Devolution, that I think would help, if considered as a new framework, would help make more sense out of some of the evidence that you and others are looking at, some of the evidence that is suggestive of a much different timeline. And that essentially is that there have been anatomically modern humans, that is to say, humans recognizably like you and me, been on the earth for much, much longer than is conventionally allowed for. Now, Michael gets into timelines of maybe millions of years. I don't know about that. I don't know enough about it to say, but certainly anatomically modern humans, intelligence on a level, on a par with our own for much longer than conventional history and archaeology suggests.
Well, yes, I certainly I would agree with that for sure. And it's a little bit mind-boggling when you know how old some of the evidence is. And I'm again, that's certainly not my field, and I'm no expert in that. But I have no doubt there were civilizations that go beyond the current acceptable timeframes, and they, in particularly in the Pacific. I mean, the Pacific Islanders, they, like the Hawaiians and the Maoris, and they all speak of their lost lands, their lost motherland, their lost homeland, and in fact, some refer to that being Mu, literally. So it's like that all is sort of ignored. I mean, again, it's difficult to prove because most development, if there's water involved, it's around the shores, and if that's gone. But I think it would be a good idea to pay a little bit more attention to some of these oral histories, as there's some pretty well, in fact, in the Mu or the Menahunis, the little people of Hawaii, they were in the mid 1800s. They were listed on the census in the Hawaii census records. So, that's it sounds a bit far-fetched, but there's actually physical evidence if one, should investigate.
Okay, so you mentioned Mu there, which is like two letters of the word Lemuria. We're talking here about, again, antediluvian civilization, speculated about. We include Atlantis in this. Of course, this is all written off by mainstream history and archaeology as pseudoscience, pseudo-history. But clearly what we're looking at, call it what you like. Lemuria is just a name, Atlantis is just a name, but there are names that represent something, which is the evidence, increasing evidence for some kind of advanced civilization in the distant past. And we have the evidence we have for it, at the very least, are the megalithic sites. How were these things created? I mean, even the Great Pyramid, we go to Egypt here and we look at these things. There are theories that have been advanced about their construction. Some people are convinced by those. Others have shot holes in these theories, saying it couldn't possibly have been done that way. But perhaps at this point, we should say a word about this timeline, because Lemuria is obviously in the title of your book, in whether you consider it to be myth or pseudo-history or whatever it happens to be. Lemuria is said to predate Atlantis, which predates, obviously, the deluge Atlantis famously is described as being lost in a great flood. And then we begin the epochs of time that we know about, say, for example, going back to Göbekli Tepe, 10,000 BC, etc. So just give us your, any thoughts or any take you have on the timeline of the civilizations, because you've used Lemuria in the title of your book for a reason.
Well, it's always difficult to start to determine timelines and dates and that sort of thing for obvious reasons. But when the culture of Mu or Lemuria was inundated, and this is also repeated in the myths and oral histories of Pacific Islanders, even the Japanese, they had migrants coming from the east, from the lands that sank. So this concept of a flood, a catastrophe, is also consistent in the Pacific. So Mu, Lemuria, it's that would have been in existence before this catastrophic flood or whatever happened, whether the meteors or. But it's complicated, and then there are survivors that I feel remembered their motherland, and eventually through their legends and memories came back and resettled these islands at a later date. But the problem is, I don't see Mu and Lemuria as just a time frame. I mean, it was more of a culture and a civilization, and a specific time and place. It went on for millennia, and if that was the initial matriarchy motherland, after reading Churchward, and I think he may not be correct about a lot of things, but he makes a good point, and I do have some evidence in my book about petroglyphs that are connected with his theories. He mentions Atlantis being a colony of Mu. And so there were at least some migrations to that area and how far they went. So it's all, it's just not very clear cut, but the describing Mu as more of a matriarchal, perhaps peaceful civilization, and Atlantis is perhaps more technical and aggressive. And so there was a point where there was balance, but and many sites, I think, in Europe and some in certain of the Latin American countries show that these themes, they were also carried through to Atlantis. And then, credit is always given to Atlantis, I guess is the point I'm trying to say, where sometimes it's more of a combination. Anyway, it's a very difficult topic, and the problem with a lot of the current memories and legends of the Pacific, it's just so old that there aren't many. There's not a lot of documentation of that.
So remind me, Carole, you mentioned the name Churchward. Tell me about him. Remind me why that's significant, because I know the name, but I just can't quite remember the context.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com